Agnus Dei.
It's late September of the year 1066. William of Normandy lands in Sussex with an army 7,000 men strong to join the fight for the English throne. King Harold Godwinson rushes back south to London to mount the resistance against yet another invader. A few weeks later, the two armies met in the decisive encounter on the hills near Hastings, a turning point in English history. Harold, at York, learned of William's landing on or about October 2nd and hurried southward, gathering reinforcements as he went. By October 13th Harold was approaching Hastings with about 7,000 men, many of whom were half-armed, untrained peasants. He had mobilized barely half of England's trained soldiers, yet he advanced against William instead of making William come to meet him in a chosen defensive position. The bold yet ultimately unsuccessful strategy is probably explained by Harold's eagerness to defend his own men and lands, which William was harrying, and to thrust the Normans back into the sea. William, warned of Harold's approach, determined to force battle immediately. At dawn on October 14th William moved toward Harold's army, which was occupying a ridge 10 miles northwest of Hastings. Harold's English army, lacking archers and cavalry, prepared for defense on the protected summit of the ridge. He placed himself, his housecarls, and his other trained troops around his standard at the summit of the ridge, at which points the slope became steep enough to protect both flanks. As the Bayeux Tapestry shows, both had horses, helmets, mail armor, shields, swords and bows. The main difference was the Norman use of cavalry. English armies used horses for getting around, but on the battlefield they fought on foot. At the Battle of Hastings, these different military cultures met head-on. More is known about the Norman deployment. Duke William appears to have arranged his forces in 3 groups, or battles, which roughly corresponded to their origins. The left units were the Breton, along with those from Anjou, Poitou, and Maine. The centre was held by the Normans, under the direct command of the Duke and with many of his relatives and kinsmen grouped around the ducal party. The final division, on the right, consisted of the Frenchmen, along with some men from Picardy, Boulogne, and Flanders. The front lines were made up of archers, with a line of foot soldiers armed with spears behind. The cavalry was held in reserve, and a small group of clergymen and servants situated at the base of Telham Hill was not expected to take part in the fighting. The battle opened with the Norman archers shooting uphill at the English shield wall, to little effect. The uphill angle meant that the arrows either bounced off the shields of the English or overshot their targets and flew over the top of the hill. The lack of English archers hampered the Norman archers, as there were few English arrows to be gathered up and reused. Nonetheless, the Duke ordered his infantry head up the slope to test Saxons' lines. He counted on his footmen to provide the main fighting brunt of the battle, but despite their best efforts, they were unable to open gaps in the solid shield wall. As William of Poitiers recorded, it was a strange kind of battle, one side attacking with all mobility, the other withstanding, as though rooted to the soil. So, William sent idling cavalrymen, hoping to crush Harold's solid defense. The easy slope allowed William's knights an open approach, against which Harold relied on the close shield wall formation of his trained troops to hurl back and dishearten the enemy. The heavily armored knight, riding a powerful charger and holding couched a heavy thrusting lance, was still 100 years away. Norman armor was flimsy, the horses light and unprotected, and the knights, using javelins, maces, and swords, had to engage the English infantry hand to hand. Harold's forces repulsed the first Norman attacks, the English battle-axes cleaving the Norman shields and armor. William's forces regrouped, but then some of them on the left flank, hearing a rumor that the Duke had been killed, fled in panic. Some of the English began to pursue them down the hill. To stop panic spreading and rally his troops, William rode out in front of them, raising his helmet to show his face and shouting, "Look at me. I live, and with God's help I shall conquer." In a successful countercharge, his troops surrounded the pursuing English forces and annihilated them. The immediate crisis had passed. William pressed his cavalry charges throughout the day, interspersing them with flights of arrows, and annihilating considerable numbers of Englishmen, whom he drew from their positions by feigning retreat, twice. They were partly successful, but the English line still held. The defense, hard-pressed, depleted, and tiring, was worn down and slowly outnumbered. Harold's brothers, Geirth and Leofwine, fell, and, according to the Bayeux Tapestry, Harold himself was killed late in the afternoon when he was struck in the eye by an arrow. We can only imagine the grim scene, the hillside slippery with blood and littered with bodies, arrows, and discarded and broken weapons, the tiredness, hunger and fear of the surviving combatants, and the commanders shouting to rally their exhausted forces. William of Poitiers recorded that the Anglo-Saxons were so tightly packed together that the dead could scarcely fall, and the wounded could not remove themselves from the action. William is said to have had 3 horses killed beneath him. Of course, the Battle of Hastings was only the start of a massive upheaval. After his victory, William marched on London, and he was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066. A generation later, the Normans had fundamentally transformed the country they had conquered, from how it was organized and governed to its language, laws and customs, and perhaps most visibly today, its architecture. Soon after the conquest a wave of castle building began across England, in order to secure the Normans' hold on power.